Hello, and welcome to our second part of this fifth lecture in physiological psychology. This is the second part of structures of the vertebrate nervous system. Today we'll be talking about some major components of the brain. In our next lecture, we'll focus in more detail on the cerebral cortex, which is really what we call the association cortex and where a good part of the sort of psychological functioning goes on. Today's lecture will focus on some of the subdivisions, including in particular some subcortical structures that are particularly important for things like, keeping us alive, that sort of thing. The first thing to understand about the vertebrate brain is, much like many other parts of science, there are different names for different things, and how people divide it. The brain into its area is really oftentimes very not always the same, so it's a little bit confusing as to what goes where. For the most part, in this course, we'll be focused on structures and functions and about where they're located. So the forebrain, which includes the cerebral cortex, is often called different things. So the prosencephalon is also often thought of as the cerebral cortex. The diencephalon, which is the between brain, is usually the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The telencephalon includes the cerebral cortex, hippocampus, and basal ganglia. And we'll talk about the cerebral cortex as its own structure because it really is very different from everything else. All the rest of this stuff I refer to as being subcortical structures. So the cortex is really separate for me from the rest of these structures. The midbrain is the mesencephalon, which means middle brain. This includes the tectum, the tegmentum, the superior colliculus, the inferior colliculus, and the substantia nigra, and then finally the hindbrain, which is sometimes called the rhombencephalon, includes the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. Now, of course, oftentimes these are also then subdivided into different systems based on their functioning. So the motor system is going to include the substantia nigra and the basal ganglia. The limbic system is going to include the hippocampus, the amygdala, the fornix, and some other related structures, including the hypothalamus. So each of these structures and their functions oftentimes comes up under different systems. And so there's just different ways of talking about this kind of anatomy and physiology. So today we'll talk first about the hindbrain, and then the midbrain, then the forebrain, then we'll talk about the cerebral cortex in more detail in our next lecture. We'll talk a little bit about the ventricles and the meninges and the dura, which are some other anatomical structures which are of importance. So the hindbrain consists of the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. This is located at the posterior portion of the brain. The hindbrain structures, the midbrain, and other central structures of the brain combine to make up the brain stem. So when people talk about the brain stem, it includes a number of structures. We'll talk primarily at this point about the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum as being part of the hindbrain, and we move up to the midbrain, which includes the tectum, the inferior and superior colliculi, and then move on from there. So let's start with the medulla. The medulla, which is often called the medulla oblongata, is located just above the spinal cord. It's really kind of like an enlarged extension of the spinal cord. Responsible for all of our vital reflexes, such as breathing, heart rate, vomiting, salivation, coughing, and sneezing. The medulla includes what's called the vagus nerve, which oftentimes can be responsible for things like fainting. So these kind of basic vital reflexes are all part of the medulla. Coming out of the medulla in related areas are the cranial nerves. These all intersect with subcortical structures. They allow the medulla to control sensations from the head, muscle movements in the head, and many of the parasympathetic outputs that we talked about previously. So to take a look at the cranial nerves, these come into the medulla, into the pons, as well as into the thalamus. So for example, the optic nerve synapses directly at the thalamus, but also at the superior and inferior colliculi. Include some inputs from the senses. Each of these cranial nerves has a particular function. These include the olfactory nerve, which is our primary sense of smell, the optic nerve, which is or visual processing, the oculomotor nerve, which controls our eye movements and pupil constriction. It has some particularly important synapses with the frontal eye fields, which helps us with things like depth perception. The trochlear nerve also helps control our eye movements. The trigeminal nerve includes skin sensations for most of the face, control of jaw muscles for chewing and swallowing. The abducens, which also is involved in control of eye movements, so the three different eye movement directions involve these three different nerves. The facial nerve includes taste from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, control of our facial expressions, crying, salivation, and dilation of the head's blood vessels. The statoacoustic nerve, which is also called the vestibulocochlear nerve, is involved in our hearing and sense of equilibrium. The glosopharyngeal is involved in the rest of our taste and other sensations from the throat and posterior third of the tongue, control of swallowing, saliva, throat movements during speech. The vagus nerve includes sensations from the neck and thorax, control of the throat, esophagus, and larynx, and the parasympathetic nerves to the stomach, intestines, and other organs. So this is, can be involved in things like vomiting, motion sickness, and things like fainting. So oftentimes people have what's called the vagus response, and then blood pressure will drop very quickly and faint. The accessory nerve controls neck and shoulder movements, and the hypoglossal control of the muscles of the tongue. There are some mnemonic devices for remembering the 12 cranial nerves. Whichever of these works best for you, you can try to use them. These are from a website I found that allows you to sort of remember these in their order. So if you find that helpful, that's there for you. So, summary of the cranial nerves, you can see involved in a lot of different major functions. You can see the vestibulocochlear nerve is coming out of the cochlea and the vestibular apparatus, which we'll talk about in coming lectures. The vagus nerve is involved in lungs, heart, digestion, sorry, can't remember what that was. You can see the facial nerves involved in our facial processing, the trochlea, oculomotor, and optic nerves, all involved in eyes and eye movement. Trigeminal nerve, the olfactory nerve, and the glosopharyngeal nerves, all of these are, of course, involved primarily with face and head. Moving on with our discussion of the hindbrain is the pons. Pons lies on each side of the medulla. It's ventral and anterior of the medulla. The term pons is Latin for bridge, and in fact the primary function of the pons is the crossing over of information in the somatic nervous system. So axons from each half of the brain cross to the opposite side of the spinal cord, such that the left hemisphere controls the muscles of the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left. Also, consistent with that, the sensory information from the right side of the body travels to the left hemisphere, and from the left side of the body to the right hemisphere. So the pons is where that information crosses over to the other cerebral hemisphere. So you can see these are very thick bundles of neurons crossing over from one side of the spine to the other side of the brain. So it basically bridges that information across to the other side. This connects, of course, also with the cerebellum and some other structures. The cerebellum is a structure located in the hindbrain with many deep folds. Cerebellum basically means small brain. It really looks and has its own really unique structure and function. This is the only location of Purkinje cells. It helps regulate motor movement, balance, and coordination. It's also important for shifting attention between auditory and visual stimuli. As you can see here, very detailed, lots and lots of neurons here in the cerebellum. Cerebellum seems to be involved with precisely regulating sensory motor integration. So, for example, this is where we're able to balance, do things like catch a ball, for example, that involves very precise spatial temporal regulation. That all seems to be involved here in the cerebellum. When we talk later about the vestibular system, that balance and orienting and coordination seems to be involved in the cerebellum, and in particular, alcohol seems to have a dramatic effect on the cerebellum. The midbrain consists of the tectum, the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi, the tegmentum, and the substantia nigra. And we'll just talk about these one at a time. The tectum is the roof of the midbrain, so it's right there at the top. Located adjacent to that are the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. These process sensory information, and there seems to be some overlapping sensory information between things like the visual and auditory system, and between the eye movement, the frontal eye fields, and the vestibular system. So this is where we get some of the sensory motor integration beginning. So one of the ways in which we're able to process visual and auditory information together. It starts there at the superior and inferior colliculi. The tegmentum consists of the nuclei for the cranial nerves and part of the reticular formation. The reticular formation will have some important roles to play in a variety of functional areas we'll talk about later on in the term. So that's right there at the top of the pons, located there atop the brainstem. So you can see here you have the medulla, the pons, the tegmentum, and the tectum, all shown here in this diagram. The final part of the midbrain includes the substantia nigra, which you can see located right here. The substantia nigra is particularly important as it is part of the motor system, so this gives rise to the dopamine-containing pathway that facilitates readiness for movement. And in fact, the substantia nigra is substantially degraded in individuals with Parkinson's disease. In fact, Parkinson's disease is primarily a disease of the dopamine-containing neurons in the substantia nigra. So it will play an important role in our understanding of movement, and we'll talk a great deal more about that later in the semester. So if you look here at the basal ganglia, which are the structures involved in movement, this includes the globus pallidus, the putamen, nucleus accumbens, which is involved in the reward pathway, as is the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra are right here on each side, right next to the red nucleus. It's called the substantia nigra because they appear black. In fact, that's what substantia nigra means, is black body. So you can see them pretty clearly here on this MRI scan. And if you look here, getting a broader view of all of these structures, we have the spinal cord coming up, the medulla, the pons here, cerebellum, structures of the midbrain, including the inferior and superior colliculi, the tectum, then we have here the thalamus right at the top of all of that. Then we'll talk more about these other structures as well. So the cerebral cortex wraps all around these subcortical structures. In here we have structures like the hippocampus. The nucleus accumbens is located here. This is the brain's pleasure center, which is located really quite close to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So these structures of the forebrain that I've just been pointing out, the most anterior and prominent part of the mammalian brain is the two cerebral hemispheres. This consists of the outer cortex as well as some subcortical regions. The outer cortex is known as the cerebral cortex, or sometimes it's also known as the neocortex, because it appears in terms of evolution to be the newest part of the brain. Pretty much every vertebrate species has all the structures we've talked about already, including cortex. It's the amount of cortex that really seems to separate human beings from other species. And in particular, more advanced species tend to have more cerebral cortex. So each side, of course, receives sensory information and controls motor movement from the opposite side or contralateral side of the body. The exception to this are the eyes. It's the right visual field, so if you're looking at a point in space, everything to the right of that goes to the left hemisphere, and etc. So just take a look at the cortex and its subcortical structures. We have a dorsal view of the brain on the left and a ventral view of a slice of the brain on the right. We'll talk more about the lobes of the cerebral cortex in our next lecture. But I do want to point out these are the ventricles we'll talk about here in a little bit. This is where cerebrospinal fluid flows throughout the brain to provide support, as well as providing a way to provide a way for waste products to be taken out of the brain and to nourish some of these subcortical structures. So we have the lateral ventricles. Here we have the basal ganglia we've just been talking about. The hippocampus, which really wraps itself around these ventricles. And then the thalamus, which is the sensory switchboard of the brain. So the forebrain is divided into a number of systems. The limbic system consists of a number of interlinked structures that form a border sort of around the brainstem and also wrap around the ventricles. This includes the olfactory bulb, which is where the olfactory nerve synapses and is the beginning of our sense of smell. The hypothalamus, which in conjunction with the pituitary gland directs and sort of commands and controls our endocrine system. The hippocampus, which is primarily involved in learning and memory, and in particular our ability to navigate and remember places. The amygdala, which is involved in emotional processing, in particular fear and aggression. And the cingulate gyrus, which is part of the cerebral cortex. So these structures together from the limbic system, they're particularly involved in memory, emotion, and of course our sense of smell. So if you take a look at this within the brain, as you can see, here's the thalamus. These structures sort of wrap themselves around the thalamus. So we have the fornix, which is also sometimes included as part of the limbic system, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the olfactory bulb is located here. Can't really see it here because it's so small. Located here right at the back of our sinus cavities. The hypothalamus, also very small here, right at the end here, and then the pituitary, which is at the end of the pituitary stalk. So these structures, along with the cingulate, which wraps around this area here, is what we consider the limbic system. So the olfactory bulb is, of course, where our sense of olfaction or sense of smell is processed. The hypothalamus is the master of the endocrine system. It's connected to the pituitary by the infundibulum, which is also known as the pituitary stalk. You can see that here we have the pituitary gland connected by the infundibulum, and then we have the hypothalamus here, which has a number of smaller nuclei which are involved in some very specific functions, which we will get into in greater detail throughout the term. The hippocampus is critical for memory formation, spatial memory, and navigation. There's a really fascinating study that was conducted on cab drivers in London. They did brain scans when they first started driving taxis, and then came back and scanned them later after they become experts. And obviously that requires a great deal of navigation to be able to do by memory. This is sort of before, or certainly maybe even in the early days of GPS. And what they saw is that they actually could see increased growth of the hippocampus in these cab drivers because they were learning, they had done so much spatial navigation learning as part of their jobs as cab drivers. The amygdala is an almond-shaped structure associated with emotions. We'll talk a great deal about that when we talk about emotions later on in the semester. You'll notice the amygdala is located right next to the hippocampus. There's a reason to believe that's why some of our more emotional memories have such a stronger component to them, because they are so directly tied in with one another. It's also why we believe our sense of smell can be tied directly with our emotions, and perhaps also with sort of evoking a stronger sense of memory. The cingulate gyrus of the cerebral cortex is particularly important for memory and emotional processing, and we'll talk a great deal about the cingulate when we talk more about memory, particularly the anterior cingulate. So that'll be something we'll get into more when we start talking about memory consolidation and the role of this medial temporal complex, which includes the hippocampus, in formations of memory. So to get sort of a different view of this, you can see the cingulate gyrus, which wraps around there to the hippocampus. The olfactory bulb tied in there with the cingulate and the hippocampus with the amygdala. Mammillary bodies are sometimes also included in the limbic system, and they are also important for memory. This is the part of the brain that is damaged in Korsakoff's amnesia. And again, we'll talk more about that later on. The structures underneath the cortex that are oftentimes called the Diencephalon are the thalamus, which is a relay station from the sensory organs and the main source of input to the cortex. So we'll talk about the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is involved in our sense of, or is directly involved in vision, and then the medial geniculate nucleus, which is involved in our sense of hearing. The hypothalamus is, again, this small area near the base, which conveys messages to the pituitary gland to alter the release of hormones. It's associated with behaviors such as eating, drinking, sexual behavior, and other motivated behaviors. And when we start talking about internal regulation, temperature control, thirst satiety, eating, and sexual behavior, the hypothalamus would involve a great deal in all of those components. Again, the thalamus and the hypothalamus together form what people often call the diencephalon. So to get a closer look at this, you can see here where we have the lateral nucleus, the pulvinar nucleus, the dorsal medial nucleus. All these are involved in different sensory information. We'll talk more about those later on in the term. Pituitary gland is a hormone-producing gland found at the base of the hypothalamus. We'll spend some time talking about it when we talk about reproductive cycles, hormone cycles in more detail. The basal ganglia is particularly important for under our motor abilities. This includes the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. We'll talk a great deal more about how these structures are interrelated and how they form excitatory and inhibitory connections with one another. So they are associated with planning motor movement and with some aspects of memory and emotional expression. In particular, they're involved in non-conscious forms of memory, and they're also important for attention, language planning, and other cognitive functions. So they are particularly important for a number of our cognitive functions. In particular, it appears they're mostly involved in skill acquisition and other sort of non-conscious forms of memory, such as language. So if you take a look again from a different view, you can see here we have the putamen, the globus pallidus, the thalamus, and the caudate nucleus, and you can also see the amygdala here, which sometimes people include in the basal ganglia. So the basal forebrain is composed of central structures that lie on the dorsal surface of the brain. This includes the nucleus basalis, which receives input from the hypothalamus and basal ganglia, which also sends axons that release acetylcholine to the cerebral cortex. And this is important in our arousal, wakefulness, and attention. This forms part of what we call the default network, whereby we're at our sort of normal level of arousal and wakefulness. And that can be activated when we need to have a greater or sudden need for attending to important stimuli. This then forms what we call the subcortical attentional network, which is involved in our sense of alerting. And so if we have some sort of warning signal, startle response, that sort of thing, that will activate the subcortical attentional network, which will then focus our attention on important sort of life-threatening information. So the last brain structure I want to talk about before we talk about the ventricles and the meninges is the hippocampus. It's a large structure located between the thalamus and the cerebral cortex. It's located just below the temporal lobes. It's called the hippocampus because it's supposed to be shaped like a seahorse, I guess, in theory. I've never quite seen it look much like a seahorse, but that's what it's supposed to look like. Located towards the posterior portion of the forebrain, and this is critical for storing certain types of memories, particularly new events. If you take a look at, again, sort of a different view here. This is the hippocampus here. We know that the hippocampus is involved in taking our experiences and converting them into longer-term memories. The exact nature of that process is still under investigation, but the hippocampus is essential for new memories. So we'll talk about patient HM who had both of his left and right hippocampi almost entirely removed in surgery, and afterwards he was no longer able to form new memories. And so we know this part of the brain is particularly important for that. The last two things to talk about in terms of general introduction to these brain structures are the ventricles. These are the 4 fluid-filled cavities within the brain central canal containing cerebrospinal fluid, which is a clear liquid found in the brain and spinal cord. Provides cushioning for the brain, as well as reservoirs of hormones and nutrition for the brain and spinal cord. So it serves some incredibly important functions. Now, important to understand, it's possible for this system to get out of balance. So in infants you can have what's called hydrocephalus, where a blockage causes a buildup of too much cerebrospinal fluid. In older adults you can get what's called normal tension hydrocephaly, which is a narrowing of the cerebral aqueduct or the central canal, and you can end up with increased pressure on the brain, which can then result in some early onset types of dementia. So it's really important for the system to be functioning and working well. The last thing to talk about are the meninges, which are the membranes that surround the brain and the spinal cord. The dura mater is sort of the outermost layer, so if you took your skull off, the first thing you would see is the dura mater. It's a tough covering between the skull and the meninges. It looks like a brown paper bag, truth be told. It almost feels like it too. It's a pretty tough outer covering there, obviously, to protect the brain and to keep the cerebrospinal fluid sort of sealed in. Underneath that are the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater, which are the next sort of layers of protection over the cortex. These parts contain pain receptors. There are no other pain receptors in the brain aside from in the membranes. If you end up with something called meningitis, this is the inflammation of the meninges and is particularly painful. Most college students have been vaccinated for viral meningitis, but this can be particularly painful. And meningitis is just a general term for diseases that cause inflammation of the meninges. It can be painful. It can also be quite dangerous. The swollen blood vessels in the meninges are what are actually the cause of migraine headaches. So increases in blood vessels in those meninges are one of the things that can cause headaches. I want to add one more note to this discussion of the dura. This is, there's lots of blood vessels. The brain's got lots of blood vessels in particular, but the meninges do as well. Sometimes you can hear what's called a subdural hematoma. And it's basically what's happened is you have a bruise underneath the dura, which is causing blood to pool. That blood then pools underneath the dura and then pushes downward on the brain. Obviously the skull can't move outward, so the brain squishes inward. And so this can be particularly dangerous for an individual who's had this kind of injury, and oftentimes will require surgical intervention and emergency surgical intervention at that. Well, that's an introduction to a number of these structures. This is a basic introduction. We're going to get into how these structures work together, but it helps to have a sort of an overall tour of the brain before we get started. And we'll talk a great deal more about the cerebral cortex and its sort of anatomy and physiology in our next lecture. All right, thank you.